So my name is Casey Willis. I am the Maine Tree Farm Program Coordinator, and I'll be giving the first presentation on Tree Farm, obviously. And Julie, if you want to give a brief introduction.
Hi, my name is Julie Davenport. I am a district forester with the Maine Forest Service. I work in the Western Kennebec County and Franklin County area. So I am a big history nerd, so I'm really excited to talk to you guys about this stuff today. Hopefully, if you're signed up for this, you're going to be interested in what we're going to talk about. But I've got 2 pages of notes here that I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to fill you in that my land use history one has smaller writing on it than my signs and clues to look at things. So don't be disappointed, but there's just a little bit more oomph to some of that. So I'm going to try not to bog you down with too much. But without further ado, let's try to get going on this thing. So we already know quite a bit about what goes on in forests based on what we learned, hopefully, in high school biology class, and maybe some folks remember that and some don't. But forests tend to behave in a fairly predictable way when they grow in after a disturbance. So things change over time. This image that I've got here is kind of demonstrating that if you take an open piece of ground that's not really growing anything, first you'll get grasses, shrubs will grow in eventually. You'll start to get some of those early successional shade intolerant species. Over time, that starts to shift, and you end up after quite a while with a more shade tolerant climax type species setup of a forest. Think like your um, big sugar maples and your yellow birch and things like that. Not necessarily old growth, but maybe old growth adjacent would be a good way to think about it. So what are some of the things that cause disturbance? There could be fire. In our part of the country, past use of pasture and agriculture is a huge cause of disturbance historically. Logging would be considered a disturbance, and I think sometimes disturbance, you think disturbing seems like a negative connotation. I'm using this neutrally. So logging can be a disturbance, blights or other forest health issues. Beavers can actually be one of the #1 causes of disturbance. And then more natural things like blowdowns or wind events or some other kind of natural feature that would lead to a significant disturbance in the forest that it would respond from. So to give all of this a little bit of background of what we're going to be thinking about and trying to piece clues we see on our own property together with, I'm just going to kind of go through the land use history of the New England forested areas for kind of, this is going to sound overwhelming, but for the last 10,000 years. So as we probably all know, if you've been in New England for very long, the glaciers formed a lot of what we see on our landscape today. It shaped a lot of our soils, a lot of our drainage types, all kinds of things like that. So the glaciers, for the most part, receded from our neck of the woods around 10,000 years ago. And not long after that was the time that the first people started to settle this area. And that would have been the Native Americans. Um, I'm I think it's pretty hard to give any kind of a history presentation and not talk about the Native Americans since, they've been on this landscape for 10,000 years. Well, more of the folks that we often think of with the more recent history, really, the colonists have only been here for about 250 of that. So I do want to kind of, I don't really know quite as much information about what those folks were doing on the landscape. That's something that I'm trying to work on as I push further back into history. But for the most part today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I know. So we are going to kind of skip ahead quite a while and talk about starting in around the early to mid 1600s. We started to see colonists arriving and settling the area from Europe for the most part. This picture over here on the right of the screen is taken from the Harvard forest dioramas, which that's actually a book, and I'll mention that towards the end. I don't have a copy of it, but I'd really like to. A little while back, some folks at Harvard worked really hard to create these paintings that basically visualized what our landscape in New England looked like quite a while back. But So that's a really cool thing to look through. This is just one of the pictures that shows the area, how it probably looked once the colonists and the settlers were pretty well established. So when people first got here, for the most part, a lot of men came first. They would spend about 2 to 4 years working on getting things set up before the women and kids would come. And from what I understand, one man could clear about 3 acres in like a late summer, early fall season with an axe. In the spring, they would often burn the wood and burn that area and collect all of the pot ash that they would then use to make guns, gunpowder, and soap. So I don't know about you, but I don't think I would be capable of clearing 3 acres in a year by myself with an axe. So that's actually pretty impressive when you start to think about it. Um, so we saw a lot of forest getting cut for that kind of thing. I wouldn't say on like a massive scale, but that was kind of one of the first colonist-driven disturbances that we started to see. One of the big things that happened, probably a lot of folks are already familiar with this, is that while we were still kind of under European rule here, white pine was determined to be, or was discovered to be, a really hot commodity. It turns out that the eastern white pine that grows here in the United States, or in the northern New England really, is kind of unlike trees that grow anywhere else in what had been discovered in the world at this time. So they grow really tall and really straight. Um, they had a lot of quality for ship masts, and that was something that couldn't really be found anywhere else in the world at the time. So the crown decided that anything 24 inches and over was going to be property of the king and be used for the British Navy. Um, in around, let me look at my notes here, in probably closer to 1700s, they actually reduced the diameter limit on that to 12 inches, which is pretty significant. But the white pine mast market drove a lot of what we saw happening even today. What we'll notice is you'll see roads like Mast Landing, things named for, basically things that are related to white pine being used for ship masts. And that was a huge market, right? They had to get the trees out whole from the woods down to the harbor where they were able to be floated out and used for ship masts. That's what's being shown in this black and white photo near the bottom. So surveyors would go out, they would mark the king's arrow, which is this 3-line scribe mark into the bark of the tree, and that indicated that the tree was the property of the crown. It was illegal for the colonists to cut it and use it for their own use. Like I said, initially it was a 24-inch diameter limit that later got dropped down to 12 inches. And what we saw is that actually tipped off what's called the White Pine Riot. That particular event happened in the 1770s, but nobody really talks about it. But this whole fighting over the white pine, we have the resource here. We'd like to be able to use it and take credit for it, but the folks back in Europe are the ones who are profiting off of the resources that we have here, the people who are working hard to live and create a life here. So this actually is part of what drove the US Revolution. Everybody talks about the Boston Tea Party that happened in 1773, but the White Pine Riot was in 1772, and it's actually what kind of got everything started. So one of the other things that happened a lot in the late 1770s, kind of as the revolution was getting underway, is I've got this picture here of these wide pine boards. So some of the folks would actually cut and mill the larger pines that were supposed to be property of the king and use them for flooring in their own homes as kind of like an act of rebellion against the crown. So if you have a really old house and you have some of those wide pine boards, that might have been some folks giving the middle finger to the folks in Europe. So that's kind of a fun little thing that I like to think about. But yeah, what happened later on is that it didn't happen again quite in so few words, but the same issue of the white pine being something we have a lot of in Maine and this part of New England is actually came up again and is part of what drove Maine to become its own state and separate from Massachusetts in 1820. So we owe a lot to the white pine. I could talk about it all day, but I won't. I'll move on to sheep. So what do sheep have to do with land use history and New England and forestry and what happened in our woods? Well, I could tell you about that. This sheep that I have pictured here is a merino sheep. It's used a lot today, but there's kind of an interesting history that goes with this. So a long time ago, in kind of the 1700s and the very, very early 1800s, the merino sheep was bred and produced in Spain. It actually, they had an embargo on the sheep itself. So the fiber was really desirable. It's really tight, so it's not itchy, but it's really warm. And everyone all over the world wanted this fiber, but the merino sheep were only allowed to be in Spain. So there was a lot of demand for it. They were kind of able to set the price and get whatever they wanted. But what happened next is that the US ambassador to Spain lived in a small town in Vermont. This is him over here, William Jarvis. And in around 1810 or so, he actually smuggled 400 of these merino sheep into the US, into his hometown in Vermont. From there, they got bred like crazy. And this led to what is kind of known in the land use history terms as the sheep fever or the merino mania. And that was basically these sheep just did really well in our climate. Our systems and natural resources set us up really, really well for textile production. So because we had so many small streams running through lots of towns, we had a really good opportunity to create kind of mills based in run on water power. And then we had this very high value sheep fiber that was really desirable. So that in combination with a lot of the tariffs that were currently at play with some of the more European markets really put the US on the map as a textile exporter. So everybody wanted to clear their land, make room for these sheep. And again, this is happening in kind of the early 1800s. So this culminated in around 1840. And at that time, the land was pretty much the most cleared in New England that it's ever been. The population of people in New England was actually at its peak. And it didn't hit that. Well, I'm going to talk about what drove some land abandonment in just a second, but that population, after all the waves of land abandonment, actually didn't recover to the 1840s numbers until about the 1990s. So what we're picturing is quite a few people and quite a lot of sheep. So all of this sheep farming led to a lot of erosion, and it led to a lot of degradation of the soils. So unfortunately, sheep are really, really hard on the ground. So we ended up with a lot of topsoil reduction. It led to a lot of erosion. We had poor water quality at this time, and all of this basically traced back to growing a whole lot of sheep in New England. So I'm going to take a drink really quick. And I'm going to spill water everywhere. Okay. So what kind of drove these waves of land abandonment? Part of this is that we were seeing some of the land just in general, it failed. As a result of the sheep overgrazing and overusing the land, we saw some areas get burned off with fire. We saw people just abandon it because it wasn't working, and kind of start to switch to other types of crops, maybe more cows. But there were a few events that in history that also kind of led to this start of a shift of people leaving New England. One of the things is that a little bit into the past, the Erie Canal was built. So it suddenly became a lot easier for people to get further west. A lot of folks went out in the mid 1800s to fight in the Civil War. And when they got further out west, they realized these soils are a lot better than ours and they're not full of rocks. I don't think I'm coming back. So that was a big thing. A lot more rail got established around the time of the Civil War. Suddenly, there was also the Industrial Revolution happening in this time period or a little before. So we saw a big shift of folks not coming back from going west for the Civil War. We saw more products being able to be shipped by rail. So it was actually easier for some folks to just buy the products that they needed off the train, get grain from out west. It was cheaper to buy it than it was to produce it on their own land. These degraded soils were leading to a lot of things. And what the Industrial Revolution drove is a lot more bigger factories, in-town jobs. Folks were able to go to work every day instead of work to keep themselves sufficient at home. So they were buying things. We saw more dairy farms getting established that would supply milk for these people who had the in-town jobs. And that is so that was really the first big wave of land abandonment that we saw in New England. Um, and I like to think that the people who stuck it out in Maine and kept farming rocks were kind of like a tougher, more tenacious group. Um, and also, as part of my working theory for why people say New Englanders are mean, I think we're just a little bit more tenacious, right? We stuck it out and farmed rocks for 100 years. Um, so the kind of the next wave of land abandonment that we saw happened in around the time of the World War II. Part of it was World War II was one of the big drivers, is we had a lot of people leave and not come back. But one of the things that got invented around this time was refrigeration, both in home and in factories. So we saw a big shift of a lot of the larger farms or I should say the smaller farms that were supplying individual towns, shifting to being much larger farms that were able to supply the dairy and other products for much larger areas. So that was one of the larger waves of land abandonment, and then things kind of stabilized. So what we saw is kind of the hierarchy of land started to get established around this time. So basically, the worst land tended to get abandoned first, and then it kind of continued along those lines. And now, for the most part, some of the best land of all is what you're still seeing farmed today, with the exception of some really, really dedicated people who don't want to give up. Um, so I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little bit more about what things you might see in the woods and what they might tell you about what might be happening on either if it's your land or if it's somebody who you're just out checking something out. Basically, if you're seeing something, what you might be able to learn from what you're seeing. So some of the more recent stuff that you might see is damage to the existing trees. So the picture I don't know why the pictures are so fuzzy, but the picture on the left is showing some damage from a logging job that happened. If you're seeing the bark kind of rubbed off, it's probably from wood being dragged past it. If you're also seeing kind of like chunks taken out of that exposed wood under the bark, it probably got hit with an actual machine itself, either by accident or just, well, I guess usually by accident. But so if you're seeing that kind of damage, that can usually tell you that there was logging that happened. And if you're seeing some kind of residual stand damage from logging, that's telling you that your forest is at least has been there long enough that there's been logging history. On the side, it's not quite as easy to see, but what this picture is showing is, you can't see what I'm doing with my hands, I'm sorry, but kind of within that cat face, which is kind of the open scar on the tree, the wood is actually black and charred. So that is damage from a fire that went through that area. So those can be some indications that there was a disturbance in the time since the forest has still been established. Next up, some of the things that I tend to look at when I'm trying to piece together land use history is I look for what's called weevilled pine. So this picture up in the top corner here that shows this this is a really bad example, or it's a great example. It's a really bad looking tree. Um, so this is a pine that was grown in full sun. And the way that I can tell that is because this little beetle here, which it's the white pine weevil, it's native to Maine and New England. I actually think that they're kind of cute personally, but they cause the tree to grow in this kind of W-shaped, kind of swoopy, not like it's supposed to be form. So we call this weevilled pine. Some people call it wolf pine. I've heard it called candelabra pine. Basically, it looks like a head of broccoli. So pine naturally wants to grow really tall and straight. Evergreen trees in general like things really orderly. That's why they tend to grow in perfect little triangles. The main leader puts out this growth hormone called auxin. It suppresses the other branches around and says, hey, I am the one that's deciding where we're going, and we're going up. So what happens is the white pine weevil chooses to lay its eggs in the main leader, excuse me, of the white pine tree. Beetles don't see very well, but they are able to kind of see the silhouette of that leader against the bright sky. So that's one of the reasons why they only will affect trees that were grown in full sun. The other thing is that the beetle is not a very strong flyer. So once those young pine trees have kind of reached 16, 20 feet, somewhere in there. The beetle isn't as capable of getting up there and laying its eggs in the leader. But essentially what happens is once this, which this little picture over on the side here that has kind of like the yellow poof on top of the pine, that's what happens when the beetle lays its eggs. So once the larva of the beetle hatches, it eats the inside of that main leader of the pine and actually kills it off. So with that main leader gone, that production of the growth hormone auxin is halted. Then it becomes kind of a free-for-all for all of those other branches growing around the main leader on the pine to compete for who's going to be the new leader. As that kind of shakes out naturally, that gives you that appearance of those swoopy kind of U-shaped growth in the pine. Needless to say, those would not be a prime candidate for ship masts. But that is something that we really only see in pines that have been grown in full sun. So if you're seeing pines like that in your forest, that's a pretty good indicator that that area at one point in that tree's life history was fairly open, whether it was clear cut or used for some other use. We can't necessarily differentiate that just by seeing the pine, but we at least know that there was some kind of significant disturbance there that opened up the canopy quite a bit. Geez, that one is even fuzzier than the rest of them. I apologize for that. So what I'm showing here in this picture, if you can even see it where it's so fuzzy, is something called pit and mound topography. Some people will call this pillows and I'm trying to blank on what the other term for it is, but I usually call it pit and mound, so I'm just going to stick with that. And what this is caused by is when we have trees that kind of tip over or kind of fall over with their roots attached, what happens is you end up with this depression in the soil. And then over time, as that stump and tree start to rot down, you end up with a little bump on the other side of it. So you have a dip and a bump. And this can be a good indicator that the area has been forested for a long time, or at least has never been tilled or plowed. So this kind of microsite topography is something that we can look at. If we're standing in a forest, we can kind of look out across the ground and look for this kind of hummocky, undulating kind of bumps in the actual like surface of the ground. And this will indicate that it hasn't been plowed. It takes thousands of years for this to develop. So if we're seeing this, we know for a very, very long time it hasn't been plowed. On the contrary, if when you kind of look out at the understory of your forest, you're seeing that it's very flat, that tells you that it probably has been plowed, or at least tilled. So sometimes things would be tilled for hay or for pasture, but more often for crop usage in past agricultural uses. What we also can tell by looking at this type of microtopography is we can sort of piece together if there was some kind of a wind event, what direction it came in. So of course, when you see, if you can read it on this image, there's a little arrow and a sign pointing. It says that the wind was blowing that way. So essentially, if you're standing on the bump and looking over the depression in the ground, if you're standing on the mound looking over the pit, you're looking into the direction that the wind was coming from. So that can help us to differentiate if things were blown over in a hurricane or if things were blown over in more just like a high wind thunderstorm. I was going to tell you which direction indicated which, but I'm actually drawing a blank and I didn't write it down. So if you're really interested and you want to know, send me an email and I'll tell you. But one indicates the other. So that can be one thing that we can kind of piece together. I should have already mentioned him as a resource by now, but I haven't. If you would like to see an example of someone walk out onto a landscape and piece together like the exact history of what happened there down to the exact year, Tom Wessels is an incredible person who does an amazing job of this. He not only has a book, which I'll talk about toward the end, but he also has some videos where he actually goes through that process on YouTube. If you look up Reading the Forested Landscape, Tom Wessels, it's really interesting. If my presentation today is even a little bit interesting, his will be fascinating. So that's my quick plug for him. He does a really good job explaining this. On to the next thing. So one of the things that you are very likely to see if you are walking through the forest today in New England is any kind of feature made out of stone. Stone walls, stone piles, stone dumps, all of it is great. Um, these walls don't really exist for the most part in the same way in other parts of the US. It's kind of a unique, neat thing in New England. They change a little bit depending on where you are in the states. Like the walls in Connecticut look a little different from the walls in Maine. Part of that is they were doing different things and have different types of soils and rocks. Um, but probably you don't need clues to tell you where you are because you probably already know what state you're in. But I really like stone walls. I love to look at them. I love to try to think about the people who built them there. For the most part, if you're seeing a stone wall, it's probably a pretty good indicator that that area was at one point not a forest. Some quick stats for you on stone walls, just because I think that they're pretty cool. If you lined all of the stone walls in New England up end to end, there would be over 240,000 miles of stone walls. To put that in perspective, that is enough to wrap around the equator 9 times. It is also enough to make it to the moon. So all of these walls were built for the most part by hand and over the course of about 50 years. So that's pretty significant. It's definitely been said that if we were able to look at them all in one place, they would undeniably be one of the main wonders of the world. They would surpass the pyramids by far. So the stone walls of New England, very impressive. Don't nearly get enough credit for how impressive they really are. So we can tell a couple things by looking at them. If you're seeing lots so let me back up. A lot of times the stone walls were used to keep animals either in or out. If they were adjacent to an area that you're looking across and it's very flat, again, that's telling you that it was plowed or tilled at some point, so it was probably planted for crops. If there's a stone wall next to that, you can pretty much guess that the other side of that stone wall was probably used for pasture because folks did not want their animals getting into the areas that they were working really hard to plant. If you're seeing lots of really small rocks in the stone walls, sometimes you'll see kind of a double wall, like a really wide wall where the two edges are made out of the much larger rocks and the inside is kind of filled in with smaller fist-sized rocks. That can be a really good indicator that that area was probably cropped. A lot of times if they didn't have to pick up the smaller rocks, they wouldn't. But when everything got started, most of the fences were built out of wood. But over time, as the forests were cleared considerably, what we started to see is that people didn't have access to wood for fencing anymore. Any wood and lumber that they had, they were using it for more kind of higher uses like homes or other buildings. Um, so they started to shift to rocks. They basically, all of those rocks that they piled up were free materials, so they started to build their walls out of those. A lot of the fences started out as split rail fences and the rocks were kind of piled next to them. And as they rotted away or needed to be replaced, the stone walls took their place. So I talked about the size of the walls. Yeah, that's a lot of what I have to say about the stone walls. There is a lot more to know, but I don't want to spend the entire time talking about stone walls, so I'm going to move on. Some of the other things that you are likely to see in the woods that are a pretty good indicator that there was some agricultural use in on your property are is barbed wire. So in my previous job, I did a lot of work marking boundary lines. And today, a lot of the property lines in Maine and the rest of New England are actually denoted by old wire fences that run through the woods. Some of them are more straight than others. But if you are out crawling around looking for old barbed wire, stuff like that, just make sure you have a tetanus shot and wear some strong pants. Don't ask me how I know. But anyway, barbed wire was actually invented in the 1870s. So if you are seeing that on your property, you can definitely determine that something in that area was used for pasture. but just keep that number in mind, as that may give you some insight into um, the oldest possible wire you could be seeing. But if you're seeing it, it probably was fenced post 1870 at least. Some of the other things that you may encounter, man, that's a fuzzy one. Okay, gonna have to check my images later, but some of the other things you may notice is you'll see things kind of in the middle of the woods that kind of make you pause and scratch your head, like an old apple tree or something. Um, Something that maybe not everybody knows, but apple trees are actually not native to the United States. Those were brought here by the colonists from Europe and established. So those will be something that you'll find growing sometimes where like an old homestead used to be. You can look for old cellar holes. Sometimes you'll see, like I've got in this picture over here, just some flowers, especially bulbs, kind of growing in the middle of the woods. If I see flowers growing in the middle of the woods where they typically don't belong, I usually start to watch out for cellar holes and wells. So that can be, if anything, just kind of like a warning to you to not fall in a well. Um, but those can be a really good indicator that like maybe what we're seeing right now as just forest isn't what's always been going on here. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of the invasive plants that we have in our forests are also something that were kind of planted around some of those old farmsteads. So if you're seeing shrubby honeysuckle or multiflora rose, those can be other indicators that there may be some past agricultural land use history on the property that you're currently on. Um, so how can you find some more information about a particular property if you're interested? Maybe you walked out on your own land and you found some neat old stone walls and you're curious about the people who were there before or maybe what they were doing. And if you're just looking to find more, what I have posted on the screen right here is the census data. I don't remember what town this was from. It was just it is a town in Maine. I can't remember now what town, but you can look back on some old records, and I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen now because I'm going to show you some things in real time. So some of the things you can look at, old aerial photos. You can look pretty far back on Google Earth, but if you're looking to go farther, you can access old aerial photos back to like the 1930s. The state has those available. If you reach out, if you're really interested, I can help get you in touch with those. But you can also look at things like historical records. What I have here is going to be kind of fuzzy. Let me stop having my screen blurred. Maybe that will help me show you what I'm trying to show you. So these, like this is an old map. This one in particular is from 1912. Actually, now you can kind of see behind me, I have two older maps. These are for the town of Leeds, which is where I live. In case you hadn't guessed, I actually really like history, so that's why I have framed historical maps as the decorations in my home. But anyway, what you can see here is you can actually tell where like old houses used to be. So if you live on an older property, you can usually figure out, you can try to figure based on the roads and other existing features who might have owned that house. Maps like this, I got mine from the Historical Society. A lot of smaller town or county historical societies have maps like that available. So that's a really great place to start if you're trying to put some pieces together and trace things back. Somewhere else you can go from there is if you can find a copy of the like a town history book for whatever town you're looking for information in. Like this has just, again, I live in Leeds, so this is from Leeds. This has kind of like a breakdown, a lot of the families that were established in Leeds, what they did, who they were. It's not a perfect history, but it's a great place to start. So you can use the map to figure out maybe who owned your property, try to learn more about that family, some of the things that they did. With that same kind of information, some other things you can look into are, you can check with your historical society, of course, but you can look back through deed history. You can trace your deeds back. A lot of the deeds can be looked at online. Once you get back to a certain date, depending on what county you're in, those will be recorded in person, but you can go access those records anytime you want, as long as the registry of deeds is open, of course. Um, but one of the really cool things that you can actually look up for a property, especially if you are interested in kind of the agricultural history, is you can look up regular population census data from the Maine State Archives, but you can also find the agricultural census data. So what you can do is if you can figure out, where your property is and who owned it, you can look back to when they used to do the ag census data and actually get some real numbers about what was going on your property at that time. So I know of a couple properties where people know that, in such and such year, the family that owned the property was raising 5 cows and growing this many bushels of corn and had this many pigs. So if you really want to dig in and figure out exactly what was going on, you can kind of put all of those pieces together and really build up what the actual history of your property was. So if that's something you're interested in, I would recommend it. If that sounds really boring, nobody's going to make you do it, that's for sure. But I'm guessing that if you tuned into this webinar, maybe you're interested in property history, so I thought it might be worth sharing. A few other things that I wanted to recommend for resources would be, I talked a little bit about Tom Wessel's. This is his book. It's fantastic. It's called, you can't read it, it's tiny print, but it's called Reading the Forested Landscape. It's really interesting. It has a lot of pictures. It's not all words. You don't have to read it cover to cover, but if there's like certain things that you want to look at, he goes into a whole lot more detail about than I was able to go into on this presentation about, what you might see in your forest and what it might be able to tell you. I didn't want to just regurgitate his book at you, so I had to try to kind of make this a little bit, different. But if you want more, definitely check out his book. I would strongly recommend it. He's got a couple other books as well. I believe Forest Forensics is another one, but anything that he's done is really, really, really well done and really interesting. Some of the other resources is if you're really interested in the agricultural aspect of it. Clarence Day's book on 19th century farming in Maine is really interesting. It's a little bit dry. It's more of like a textbook. So I would only recommend that one to the real nerds like me. But the other resource would be the Harvard Dioramas book. It has a really interesting look into the just kind of what our landscape looked like over time and how those things changed as people manipulated the landscape. So with that said, I am done with the presentation part of my talk, so if anybody has questions, I would be thrilled to try to answer them if I can. I can put the names and titles or names and authors of the books into the chat. Yes. Does anyone else have any questions?